My name's Bill Tennyson, and before the war, I suppose I was luckier than most. I had a wife and child, a home of my own, and a good job. I worked at a factory, and I earned enough to be buying one of the cars I helped to make there.
The factory was Dagenham, and the company was Ford, who during the 1930s had been busily helping to double the number of cars on Britain's roads from 1 to 2 million. But then came September 1939, and everything changed.
I remember I often used to look at those assembly lines, turning out cars with 100, and think to myself that everyone must be travelling about and meeting and learning how the other half lived, and that was a good way of stopping misunderstandings and wars.
But it didn't. Now, with the nation at war, motoring came under strict government control. A basic petrol ration of 50 miles a week was introduced. Road signs were taken down to foil potential invaders. Air raid precautions included a total blackout. The streets were plunged into darkness.
You didn't go out unless you had to. We had no reflective paint in those days and no cat's eyes, and so it was a very dangerous business driving in the blackout. There were a lot of accidents, particularly with motorcycles, hitting the curb and being thrown from their machines, and so it was imperative that very quickly that they do something about it.
And your headlights were only allowed to give a narrow slit of light which didn't really illuminate anything. And it might have been a dead end, or there might have been an air raid shelter, a brick-built air raid shelter in the middle of it for all you knew. So we couldn't drive very fast.
In a vain attempt to reduce road accidents, white paint was daubed on almost everything in sight.
We all want to carry on as normally as possible these days. But in the blackout, it's always dangerous.
If there was a vehicle coming towards you, you didn't realise that it had any lights. And these were murder, because on a really dark night, and we used to pray for moonlight on these occasions, it was the most lethal thing I've ever done.
The blackout took a fearful toll in human life. In 1941, 9,169 people would be killed in road accidents. An all-time high, despite a reduction of more than 50% from pre-war traffic levels. But even these figures were dwarfed by the carnage of the Blitz.
I'm speaking from London. It is late afternoon, and the people of London are preparing for the night. Everyone is anxious to get home before darkness falls, before our nightly visitors arrive. The People's Army of Volunteers is ready. They are the ones who are really fighting this war. The firemen, the air raid wardens, the ambulance drivers.
We had lots of fires, lots of bombs, lots of rescuing to do. And when you're young, you just take all these things in your stride. It's something that had to be done, and you do it. And you get through it, or if you didn't get through it, it was just too bad. But you didn't worry like you do the same way when you're older.
You must have had an awful lot of experience of this sort of thing.
Who, me? Until a few months ago, my dear, I was pottering about my garden as peacefully. Where's the fire?
Down by the river. And then when you saw a woman driving an ambulance or something like that, and especially when they saw them driving one of the bigger vehicles, you looked kind of twice to make sure that it was a woman. But gradually we got used to it.
You're just the people I want. Oh, don't tell me. Where to? South Street. 90 families bombed out. Right, we're as good as they are. It's awfully good, isn't it?
Driving an ambulance was a very unnerving experience. When you were approaching the site of a bombed area, of course there were the hoses, there were all kinds of casualties around, people coming out badly dazed, and you had to avoid all these things. There was bricks all over the ground, and you had to kind of work your way through all the hazards to get to the site you wanted to get to. And it was more like driving a tank than driving a normal vehicle. And you'd be driving along 1 minute in pitch darkness, and a few minutes later you'd go around a corner and the scene would be lit up by a beautiful fire from an incendiary bomb. There was also the flashes of the anti-aircraft guns going off. Of course, these weren't much illumination. And when they were all firing and the searchlights were blazing, there was quite a lot of light at that particular point. But light like that isn't good for driving. One flash of light and then your eyes are blinded and you can't see what you're going the next minute. So it was very hazardous. And of course you had to be aware the shrapnel was flying around as well.
The noise, the fumes, the fires, people running, not many screaming, they were very well controlled, but they were running all over the place, and there were cars and ambulances and everything else, and it really was really very frightening, and the sound of the fires, it was very, very alarming. The roads were absolutely littered, and in many cases you've got half a house all across the road, so you've got to negotiate it somehow. There wasn't so much traffic, of course, which made it a lot easier, but the condition of the roads and everything was appalling, absolutely appalling.
And other walls were coming down, between the sexes and between the classes. For car owners, doing your bit meant offering lifts to total strangers, however undesirable. Middle-class drivers discovered that common people could be worth talking to. Working-class children got their first ride in a posh car. And at work, the changes were even more revolutionary.
My firm's always made a point of not employing women. They said a man should be paid enough to keep a wife and family in comfort. All that's changed now.
Not content with driving motor vehicles, they now invaded the very heart of this man's world and built them as well.
The women have picked up the work as quick as you like, and they lend a bit of colour and charm to the place.
The men might patronise them, but the war effort depended on them.
This war, more than any other in the history of mankind, is a war of transport. Every time you ride in a bus, you're using petrol that's needed to drive the machines of war. You may not be very big or very heavy, and you may not be going more than a 3-halfpenny ride, but every little counts. So save your fare and save our fuel, and march to victory with the troops.
Petrol had to be imported in tankers running the gauntlet of German U-boats. With rationing, individual brand names had vanished, and petrol was pooled. In 1942, even the basic ration was withdrawn, and private motoring went into deep hibernation. Only essential war work qualified for those precious petrol coupons. But the British spirit of enterprise and initiative rose to the situation.
A running motor car was not only very valuable, but of course the fluid which made it run, the petrol, was even more valuable. And there was a huge black market in petrol alone, people scurrying about in the dusk with jerry cans.
A British plane came down, a fighter plane came down near where we were living in the caravan. It was in engine trouble and he had to land. He wasn't killed or anything. And he went away, and so one or two of us quickly went down and borrowed his petrol.
They would dye the petrol pink, so that any petrol that was coloured pink was obviously misappropriated from the army, and that would stop the black market. Unfortunately, when you have conscription, you always get on what are known as other ranks, people far cleverer than the executive. And on the day before the first of the dyed petrol was to be used, my driver, because I had a short-term commission in the army, said to me, they're bringing a coloured petrol out tomorrow then, Gov. And I said, oh yes. And he said, two aspirins to a gallon, leave it to precipitate, the dial goes on the bottom, you can pour most of it off clean off the top.
Or you could run your car on ordinary domestic gas, carried in a roof-mounted version of the barrage balloon. Speed depended largely on which way the wind was blowing. Engine performance was inferior to petrol, while range was limited to about 30 miles between refills. But it was legal, and it worked. But most would-be motorists accepted defeat and laid up their cars. cars to await the return of better times. The end of the war was a time for celebration and looking forward. People wanted a fresh start and a change from the old Tory values of the pre-war class system. In the general election of 1945, the Labour Party swept to power in a landslide victory. But it remained to be seen what the policy of a socialist government would be for that capitalist status symbol, the motor car.